Respecializing, or respeccing, is a little odd to discuss specifically in games focused on their build systems. In games in general, sure, this is a mechanic like any other, but it could seem like talking about an undo button, something that undoes something else and has little content of its own, a utility that lots of games include, but not much more than that. And yet, as long as you agree that, at least in games with fun and interesting build systems, making a build is part of the fun, part of gameplay, I'd say that respeccing is too. In these sorts of games, I'd argue it's a bigger part of the game, not just the utility that's there just in case. And I think that's a subtle but important distinction. And there are more direct examples where playing the game is very close to respeccing. This draft mode in Nova Drift that I can't stop finding reasons to mention, where you rapidly choose like 35 upgrades and then play, really feels similar to respeccing to me, but almost as if it was implemented as more of a core game mechanic. So going one step further, is a roguelike run similar enough to respeccing that it would be useful to think of it that way? Is respeccing, in a game where you don't have to, part of the main experience or a weirdly positioned little utility? Upon further inspection, those seem like real questions to me. It turns out that respeccing can be quite vague and thus interesting to discuss, in my opinion anyway. I'm Zandy, and you're tuned into Build System Basics. Welcome aboard. Part 1. Trouble in Respecctopia. Respeccing as a concept is seemingly very straightforward, at least in a certain type of build-making experience where you make a character and run through the game with that character build. These sorts of games will often by default either not allow or not require switching up your build, but often there will be some sort of option to switch things up, maybe add a new skill to your character, usually at the cost of time and or in-game currency or like skill points or something. But if a game is going to be focused on making builds, trying new builds, or just on its build system and the experiences that can create generally, you're usually going to end up wanting to change builds more fluidly. And then the line between your one build as this normal state and respeccing as this abnormal event gets blurred. And I think that most of the total possible types of experiences that employ build systems are probably more like that, where respeccing becomes more of a casual thing. You literally just respecialize, change your specialization on the fly as part of normal gameplay. So part of normal gameplay, I'll show you what I mean. In Remnant II, where anytime out of combat, you can just open your arsenal and click one of your other builds to instantly load in a completely different playstyle, or 3 if you like. I'd say you definitely respect, but I mean, depending on your preferences, you might be doing that several times in each area before most bosses or between boss attempts to try a new strategy or counter a random boss modifier. Yeah, having random modifiers on enemies is much less of a problem if the player can swap into half a dozen other builds at the press of a button. And all of that positions respeccing as arguably a much more core part of the experience if you want it to be. The game design is not resisting you if you want to change your build a lot. You can respec as much as you want for free. And by giving you build options that you can't use all at once, I'd say they're crossing over into gently encouraging you to respec. And as I gestured at earlier, in a game where each sit down involves starting up a new run, getting upgrades as you go, and having them somewhat reset when you die, you could say that's an example of being forced to respec rather than simply gently encouraged. It is interesting to note how games generally don't go that far, though. In none of these examples are you required to come up with a fully formed idea for a build on the spot, even if you have to make a new build. In some cases, you may be encouraged to respec, but you just don't have to. You can do it when you want, or you can, if you want to, just never respec, never change your build. And in other cases where you're forced to change your build, yes, you end up with a new build every session, but what is a roguelike if not a machine that causes a build without you necessarily coming up with an idea for one? You either just try to get the strongest upgrades you can and end up with something kind of unique, or you get started first and then respond to the first few upgrades you get, try to improvise a build, sort of. Depending on the game, you could try to achieve a very specific build, but my point is that the game doesn't usually force you to do that. You do have to lose your previous build and make a new one, but due to the semi-randomized upgrades, you don't have to come up with an idea for a build fully formed. So yes, some games will make respecking part of their core gameplay loop, but I think it's much less common that games will make truly brainstorming part of their core gameplay. And that makes total sense to me. Coming up with new intentional ideas takes energy. That weird mental energy tank we humans have, where if you have a fascinating discussion for 3 hours, you may find yourself really tired afterward despite having physically relaxed that whole time, and it's not entirely clear what resource you used up, that kind of thing. I guess the reason most games don't make you truly brainstorm a build for a given play session then is that if they did, you wouldn't be able to play the game when you're tired. I know I sometimes bounce off of games that I usually like when I'm mentally drained, because the game doesn't force me to, but the way I enjoy playing the game does involve making up new ideas. And I'm just out of that juice right now, you know what I mean? Part 2, the respec gradient. Yeah, so as a result of that mental cost associated with making up a truly new idea, we have a lot of games where respecking is kind of a core part of the game, but then they also somewhat shy away from fully forcing the issue. And one surprisingly common way developers end up doing that is with a sort of gradient of respecking. Here's the setup. If respecializing is part of the core of a game, if you make lots of build choices very frequently, you may not even think of what you're doing as respecking, perhaps because it isn't a big enough or rare enough event. Roguelikes are a good example from before, but just repeatedly respecking in a role-playing game is enough that to me it kind of stops feeling like a respec in the same way. And likewise, I think there are some cases where a game doesn't have respecking, but does offer something that fills a similar role of letting you adapt, again, respecialize in some way. For the rest of this video then, I think it'll be more useful to expand the concept of respecking to include all of that stuff, basically the ways in which you mix up your build in games, surprisingly few of which may feel directly like respecking. And then the consequence of thinking about respecking in this more broad way is that games now appear to have a gradient of respec systems, several different levels of intensity of respec. For example, there are games you might think of as having build systems in which you don't formally respec. Take Disco Elysium. This is a common enough way for games to start. You make an initial build from a preset or you create your own, and these skill points persist throughout the game. You do get skill points that let you add to these various qualities, making each individual skill more or less strong, but these general qualities that you've assigned to your character are stuck. You never get a chance to respec them, ever. But then at the same time, you do get to level up quite a bit. Those initial stats you assigned only at the beginning of the game level every skill in their category, and skill points only level 1. And so as you level things up, you kind of overcome your initial biases or stats and form new strengths. Here's one of my character builds toward the end of a playthrough, and you can see that compared to my initial stat allocations on the left, intellect, psyche, physique, and motorics, which I picked at the start of my playthrough and can never change, and which boost every skill in their category, you can see that through skill points, the little white diamonds filled in on each skill, I've gained some very significant additional strengths that my character did not have at the start of the game. But the kind of ghost of those initial stats remains. There's a balance between how much I'm influenced by my initial build that I couldn't respec and my further skill point choices, which I picked throughout my time playing. I can't respec those either, but I can keep getting more skill points. And importantly, that happened very gradually. So although I definitely took my character in some new directions throughout my playthrough, that's certainly similar yet different from formal respecking. I didn't re-specialize fully on the spot. It's more like I added a specialization over time. And here you can also imagine how this balance is important for both halves of the skill building experience to feel meaningful. You're defined just enough by your initial stat points while getting just enough skill points to have new strengths partway through the game. You don't get so many that your initial stats become buried under your new strengths, nor so few that you're only ever truly good at something you were initially good at. Skill points are also worth not too much nor too little in terms of how much they affect your skill checks when added to your rolls. You roll 2d6 in this game, so you get around 7 on average. So both your initial stats and skill points have impact. Of course, if you got more of your stats early, but could respec those points, you might want that balance to be very different. Oh look, it's Baldur's Gate 3. We've got a similar thing to start with. You choose some basic initial qualities, some of which you can't change, but you allocate a lot of your stats early on. It's just that very early on in Baldur's Gate 3, you'll be able to respec all of these points. And so while you do get most of your stats right away, it works out because you get to both respec just about everything, and because leveling up is giving you new ways to use those stats in this game. You mostly get more skills rather than leveling up your skills. It's not like perfectly balancing your initial stats, and the impact of leveling up is important in every game. That just fulfills Disco Elysium's design goals pretty well. In Baldur's Gate 3, I think it's more than fine to somewhat front-load things. Of course, both of these games have another part of their build systems which you can swap around as much as you want. Well, tons of games have this. Gear, equipment and such, items. Perhaps the quintessential respec system that may not feel like one. I think it's fascinating how often gear does basically the same thing as other parts of a game's build system. You get stat bonuses or whatever it is, and yet you can almost always freely swap around gear, but you can't as often freely swap around the rest of your build. Do you see the gradient now? It's a little odd, right? Many games' build systems are built of multiple parts of different commitment levels, forming this gradient of respeccing. And I think one of the primary purposes of that gradient is to lighten the mental load, let you make bigger or smaller choices about your character. There's this satisfying little progression in a lot of games where you have parts of the build system moving from less to more flexible. Your initial stats, which you chose and can't change without making a new character, or which you have to go distinctly respec, and then skill points or leveling up, which we already covered, certainly more flexibility, while your equipment usually gives you complete freedom to switch things in and out, so you get a gradient of commitment levels while fiddling with your build. In Disco Elysium, there's also this feature called the Thought Cabinet. This is a peculiar system. If a concept occurs to you during gameplay, like you say enough communist things, then you unlock thinking about communism, or being a heavily armored man, and then you can equip it to an open thought cabinet slot. All of mine are full right now. Thoughts come in two stages, the problem and the solution. While they're slotted in at first, that represents that you're pondering them. This is sort of a research phase. You generally get some kinds of effects, positive or negative skill modifiers, for example, and you can swap thoughts you're merely researching out for other thoughts whenever you like, much like equipment. I guess the flavor is that you're focusing on different ideas when you do that. But once a thought completes research, you've thought about it enough, you internalize it, its effect transforms, usually to something both almost completely different and significantly better, but not always. And now it's permanent, unless you spend a skill point to forget it. You can't swap it in and out anymore. So this system is like a hybrid of skill points and equipment, or I guess it's equipment and then skill points. We've got a system where you spend skill points to permanently increase your stats, another system where you can increase those same stats, but you can freely swap gear around as much as you want from a big library of clothing, and then a system that's kind of in between permanent and freely swappable commitment. It's a respec gradient. This particular implementation of the system, where all three systems mostly give you the same types of bonuses to your skills, they all give you stat boosts to the same skills, is a clever approach to encourage players to use what they have by giving them other systems that can help them out if one system is inflexible or they don't wish to commit. So if there's a skill that you want to pass a check for, and you don't want to spend a skill point, you have those other two systems that can also give you the very same boosts to that skill. Like some people hoard consumables, this game says, here's a few different levels of limited resource. Surely you'll be willing to spend one of them, right? There's also literally consumables in this game, drugs, and you guessed it, those boost your stats too, respec gradient. Kind of the opposite way to implement that idea is in Remnant 2. This game lets you freely respec just about everything at basically any time, but then each part of the system gives you mostly different benefits from the others. So kind of the inverse of the way the Disco Elysium is doing it, you only really get new abilities from mods and then from your class archetypes. You rarely get an effect that directly gives you more damage except from jewelry and from your class passives. You don't usually get raw stats except from your traits. You don't really get weapon passive effects except from weapon mutators in that bottom slot. And plenty of these categories contain something you can't get much of anywhere else. For example, elemental damage is something that you rarely get except from jewelry. I particularly noticed how a given screen, like the actual interface screen for a given type of build option, those screens usually contained more than one type of distinct change for your character, like the role that rings play in your build has almost nothing to do with the role armor might play in your build, but those were on the same screen, and you're there anyway and you just swapped around your rings, perhaps you got a new one. As if the game is suggesting, why not consider changing some more stuff up if you like? But I think the end goal is similar. Get the player comfortable using those systems to have more fun. But of course, the approach is very different than from the examples I've shown you previously. We're offering the player many versions of respecking, kind of, and trying to get them to bite on one or the other. And then, of course, this version of the design is powered by absolutely free respecking for just about everything to lower the barrier of entry further. The biggest barrier is already the player's mental energy, so with this approach, I think it makes sense to offer many different versions and make them all free. I know I and some of my friends change some of this stuff way less often than others in Remnant 2, and maybe that's the system working. We fiddle with what speaks to us in our comfort zone, and we found those comfort zones because the game makes like 4 different offers for us to choose from. We could just pick which things we care about changing up. Part 3, drawbacks of respecking. This video about fun game respecking is getting kind of intense. So basically just offering a lot of freedom has its downsides. Yeah, Disco Elysium and Remnant 2 and lots of other games with their respec gradients offer a lot of options to choose from, but the trade-off is that those options are all distinct systems that work a little differently from each other. That may backfire and be overwhelming instead. Obviously, it can just get tiring to make new builds all the time, but I'm talking about simply including the option to respec. Respecking constantly can have its own drawbacks, sure, I don't know. I'm not your doctor. But even offering a lot of freedom to respec, that seems like it would reduce the pressure the player feels, but I think it can have unintended consequences. In Baldur's Gate 3, respecking is really cheap. It's a very little money outside of the early game, but I'd argue that it's still really important that it costs something, time and money, because that small cost and the modest amount of time it takes gently discourages the player from worrying too much about respecking by making it a bit inefficient to do so. If you could respec even more freely, you could gain things by respecking a truly crazy amount before most or all skill challenges, and rather than just asking the player to not do that, charging them a small fee for respecking and then requiring them to go back to camp steers them away from obsessive respecking that I think the developer thinks would be a much worse experience for most people. I think that's a good choice in this case too, perhaps the only good reason you'll commonly find to restrict respecking in some way. If something is not going to be a good experience for your target audience, it's often good game design to make doing it potentially negative, offer some resistance even if you don't prevent the player from doing it outright. By contrast, in Remnant 2, where you can freely respec before every single challenge, that's extremely quick to do, but there aren't as explicit reasons to do it, because it's just preference. Who's to say this or that build is objectively better against this boss? Yes, the bosses are very different, so you might think about that more, but it's not as if you are given as much of an explicit challenge to overcome. It's just kind of what you want to use to some extent. In the Baldur's Gate 3 situation, you've got a specific skill check with a high difficulty, and yeah, you could go make a build that just destroys that specific type of skill check. The challenge is at times more objective. There's nothing objective about whatever this thing I'm fighting is. Anyway, as long as respecking is harder than swapping to a more capable party member, the player has been steered toward a good experience, and you don't have to coddle people. I like that Baldur's Gate 3 goes no further than that. It's still very easy to respec, but it seems to be aiming to be just costly enough to make it feel sensible to stick with what you've got, or if you're otherwise happy, or again, to just swap to a party member that does that thing well. I think a lot of games that offer respecking could probably make it cheaper and lose nothing for players that don't respec a ton, while making players that do want to respec a ton very happy. I don't think you need to do much to incentivize different behavior. However, with gear items in the mix, I think things get a bit more complicated for this seemingly elegant way to handle respecking, where you just set it up so you can, but don't have to. A lot of these games contain items which you kind of need to respec to use in a meaningful way, and I have played games before where that was true, but the game simultaneously didn't allow you to respec. And in one way this is fine, of course. You could just not use everything that you find. That's gear for another type of character. I do think many games assume the player will play the game all the way through many more times to use all of that stuff that they can't use when they first find it. A little too much. Almost nobody even has the time to do that, so it's not even a matter of whether the player wants to play the game many more times through. They mostly just can't. Therefore, giving the player access to more of the game in one playthrough if they want it is perhaps more realistic, and respecking is one way to do that. But even if you can respec, I mean, look at this thing. In this sort of game, I've seen plenty of items that you get quite late in your playthrough that do extremely specific things, powerful, interesting things, but only if you make a build to complement them. For example, this weapon has the unique effect of giving you an additional reaction per turn. It's pretty likely that a lot of character concepts simply won't be able to use that, but on the right build, that is extremely powerful. So to enjoy that item, that would mean either planning from the very start of the game or respecking specifically to use it. You can respec in Baldur's Gate 3, so that's one obstacle down. But you'd also likely want to play that part of the game where you get the item in such a way as to get it as early as possible, so you actually have encounters left to do while using it. That rapier I showed you will probably be acquired by most players very, very late in gameplay. And I can imagine game designers that have included respecking not worrying about that point too much. I just think that's a potential pitfall. In no way does respecking alone remove most of the obstacles and make these items fun for most players. So I guess this is a drawback of the developer including respecking. Including respecking certainly does help. Overall in this video, I just think there's a bit more to enjoying respecking than it being a presented option. Ideally, respecking and the systems you respec with are carefully designed to help the player have fun with them, powered by psychology and understanding of the various things that keep players from enjoying what they might otherwise really like. Folks, I've been Zandy, and you've been tuned in to Build System Basics. Now go forth and respec with impunity. I was just about to get my respec on myself. Thank you to my patrons and other supporters on other platforms for supporting this video's production. And hey, if you're staying around a little longer, where are we off to next?